This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. Welcome to the Most Painful Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Hoppe. Well, this is our last show of Season 4, and we're excited to announce Season 5, which will start in the fall of 2024. In Season 5, we'll be exploring topics such as fibromyalgia, sleep, supplements for health, and a deeper dive into inflammation, and many more topics, so subscribe to receive the latest episodes. In our last episode, we spoke to Dr. Max Sun about arthritis and how it can impact the body, and helpful tips for those suffering from arthritis. If you missed this episode, you can listen to it on our Spotify and Apple feed. Research shows exercise is the best medicine for a healthy body and longevity. When we spoke to Dr. Eugene Maddock about osteoarthritis, he said motion is lotion, as being active is important to help with pain. And in the episode on strength training with Leroy Ho, we talked about the importance of strength training to allow a person to do more activities in their life. Cardio and respiratory fitness is very important for health and longevity. But what's the best way to increase your respiratory and cardio function? One method is high-intensity training, or HIIT. And today I'm joined by Dr. Martin Gibala, a professor at the School of Kinesiology at McMaster University in Hamilton. Martin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on. I'm very interested in this topic because from some of the research I've read, cardio and respiratory fitness is good for a person's longevity and health. But maybe just for the audience, you can talk about what high-intensity training is and some of your research that you've done on it.
Yeah, sure. So very simply, high-intensity interval training is just alternating bouts of relatively intense exercise interspersed with recovery periods, and that can be lower intensity exercise or complete rest. High-level athletes have used interval training for over 100 years to prepare to win Olympic gold medals. But probably over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been increasing recognition of the health benefits of interval training and the fact that it's not only for high-level athletes, and many individuals, including people with cardiometabolic disease, individuals with type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, can perform and benefit from an interval-based approach to fitness.
So when we hear a lot about Zone 2 and, the benefits that has and what they've done for testing to see if a person is in Zone 2. What's the difference between that and high intensity training? Is this something that could be combined with high intensity, or is one better than the other?
Yeah, so maybe two ways to look at this. So if you're an athlete, we talk about training zones, and the most common ones would be moderate, heavy, and severe. Zone 2 has sort of been, I don't want to say co-opted, but it's come to mean this sub-lactate threshold or relatively low intensity threshold training that you can do continuously for a long period of time. That's also known as moderate intensity continuous training. It's the typical cardio training that people think of, low intensity, moderate effort for prolonged periods. High intensity interval training is at a much higher intensity, obviously. And so one way to define that, a common definition, is you're getting up to about 80% of your maximal heart rate during the intervals, but there's no common definition of interval training. Sometimes it's referred to as just getting out of your comfort zone. And so I think sometimes interval training, many people think, oh, that's not for me because it's only something that very high level athletes should do. And a lot of the research has been showing that it's relatively intense for you. And so very often we'll talk about just a 10-point scale where 1 is laying on the couch or in bed and 10 is that sprint from danger pace, or the pace you would run at to save your child from an oncoming car. Zone 2 or moderate is maybe a 4 or 5 out of 10. High intensity interval training or vigorous effort is about a 7 or 8 out of 10. And so it's a way to normalize it, I think, for many individuals. And it's easier for them to think about, okay, a 7 out of 10, I can do that, or I know what that means for me, as opposed to saying you need to work at 82% of your VO2 max or your lactate threshold or something like that. So hopefully it's a more accessible approach to the method.
Yeah. And I mean, how do you measure VO2 max at home? There's no way really to do it, right? So I like that idea where you can kind of look at what percentage, or I guess what would you say, a scale that someone can relate to on what they have, what kind of output they have to have. But how does this, is circuit training or CrossFit training, is that in a sense a kind of a HIIT workout? Would that be considered that? I'm just trying to look at some examples that the listeners can relate to what high intensity training would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think you can apply high intensity interval training in either a common aerobic type standpoint. So that would be cycling, running, elliptical, swimming, things like that. Or you could use resistance type training, and bodyweight style training, CrossFit style training is a very common approach that can be utilized. And so I tend to take an all-encompassing view of the term. And as I say, we can think of these two big buckets of either aerobic style training, cardio style training, or resistance style training. Bodyweight style training might be one of those in-between methods. And so, you can get some strength benefits from it. Very simple, practical activities. You don't have to go to the gym. You don't need to change into specialized clothing at all. And you can get cardiovascular conditioning as well, especially if you keep the recovery intervals quite short. And we've done some research looking at that, demonstrating that.
So what would be an example of, for our listeners, a body weight exercise?
Yeah. So as we're having this interview right now, I could squat down and do a series of air squats or some burpees, but it's traditional calisthenic type style training. It could be jumping jacks. And again, that's a very simple, accessible way of training. And so that's one approach to the method. Another way is just simple stair climbing, right? You're going into work, or you're at home, or you're going to the subway, up and down the stairs a couple of times. And we've done some research looking at stair climbing as a very, again, practical, accessible method. If you have a piece of stationary equipment, you can jump on a bike. A 5x1 would be a very common protocol that we've used. So that's 5 1-minute efforts of relatively intense effort interspersed with a minute of recovery. So you add a little bit of warm up, cool down. Within 15 minutes, you've got your workout in. And again, it was only 5 1-minute efforts. So I don't think, there's an old saying, your heart doesn't know what your muscles are doing. And that's just this idea that many types of exercise can be beneficial for both cardiovascular and metabolic conditioning. And again, we like to take this very widespread view of the method, which I think also helps to make it accessible for individuals. They think, it's not something I need to go to the gym then to actually do. I can very much do this on my own.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me back to the military of circuit training.
Absolutely. The classic example I always give in talks is the 5BX, right? The classic plan that was developed by the Canadian military to keep people fit, in the far north. And so that would sort of be an early version of the method. In some ways, we rediscover the power of interval training every decade or so. So a lot of our research, it's not really new. We're just sort of, tweaking a little bit what's been known for a long time.
Yeah, and I guess we just did it without knowing. We're doing this circuit training running around, which now is called CrossFit and all these other things. But 30, 40 years ago, now I'm dating myself. That was just simply circuit training. And
I have a colleague who says, P90X, it was just 5BX without the marketing.
Yeah, that's true. And I remember that, that was almost 20 years ago, I think, the P90X, and it was the rage out there at that time. So, when we look at high intensity training, we have a lot of different people listen to this. We have clinicians, researchers, we have people who suffer with pain, and people who just want to have better health outcomes. So when you're looking at high intensity training, you said it's been around for a long time in different forms. Is there anything new in the research that you've done lately that is changing anything of the past belief on HIIT, or any ways that can provide better, outcomes? Or
I would say one of the biggest things we're learning is the potency of brief, vigorous, intermittent physical activity. And so when I say brief, I've been associated with some research that was looking at, this was large-scale studies of about 25,000 individuals, and those individuals were fitted with accelerometers so they could look at their daily activities. And even in individuals who did 3 to 4 minutes a day of vigorous, intermittent physical activity. So you can imagine that example I gave earlier of you're going to a bus stop or the subway and you pick up the pace for a minute or so. You get off a flight, and you have that option of taking the escalator, or you can grab your luggage and walk up the stairs. That would be an example of this, daily activity of living that you have to do. You can engage in a vigorous effort or in a pedestrian manner. And so again, the takeaway there was even a few minutes a day of vigorous physical activity was associated with marked improvements in health, marked reductions in all-cause mortality. So we're talking 25, 30% lower risk of dying from all causes, in particular, cardiovascular disease mortality. So I think one big takeaway, again, is just the value of brief, vigorous intermittent. You don't have to do a lot. And the big thing is just to get out of that lowest fitness level. You don't want to be in the basement. You just want to get to that next level. And that has marked improvements in your overall health profile. The physical activity guidelines are based on excellent science, but they're very daunting for a lot of people as well, right? Oh, I don't have 2.5 hours a week to do traditional modern intensity cardio. We're not ready to certainly replace or scrap the public health guidelines, but I just think there's growing evidence, again, this idea of brief, vigorous intermittent physical activity being extremely beneficial for your health.
Yeah, because we hear that a lot. When I talk to veterans who are struggling with pain or other health issues, and the military physical training was part of your life, depending what trade you're in, but majority was part of your life. A lot of these people are struggling to, in a sense, get off the couch and start working out again, and a lot of it is I just don't have the time, or a perception I don't have time to do something. So I like that idea where, hey, it's only a short 3 to 5 minutes, and it's going to help you a lot more than just, saying I don't have time.
Absolutely. We're not suggesting it's a panacea for everything, but the other example would be, maybe you're able to walk around the block at night, or you're going to pick up your mail, pick up the pace, as simple as it sounds, pick up the pace for a couple of light posts and then back off. There's just tremendous evidence coming out that may be more beneficial for you than just, again, continuing at that steady state pace. The biggest thing, as you noted, is just getting up off the couch, do something, right? Move, as you were alluding to in the introduction. But if you're perceived to be very time pressed, or you don't want to devote a lot of time to physical activity, then, huffing and puffing once in a while it's not a bad thing. We're almost taught to be afraid of raising our heart rate or getting it a little bit out of breath. And of course we could talk about all the clinical concerns potentially, but, many more people than we think can perform and benefit from vigorous intermittent physical activity. And there's even evidence showing that a single weekly bout of high intensity interval training is protective, right? Sometimes we think about, the classic beer league hockey player, right? Who gets the heart rate up on a Friday night. And, tragically, there's some times where these individuals can suffer from a heart attack. But if you take a step back and look at the evidence, even a single weekly bout of vigorous exercise is protective, for most, the rest of the time of the day when you're not being very active, you're actually protected against, more protected than you otherwise would have been against an adverse event.
So you're saying out of a 7-day week, if a person just worked out one day of that week,
it's absolutely better than doing nothing. Correct. You're going to see some benefit even with that. Obviously, what you'd like to do is do a little bit of something every day, right? Get a couple of minutes in every day. But again, even if you could only do one bout once a week, that's going to provide you with some benefit.
So if somebody went on a 40-minute walk and, 10 minutes of that was going uphill at a rapid pace, and then the rest of the 30 minutes was just a walk at a normal pace, they're getting benefit just from doing that.
They absolutely are. Now, both of those individuals are going to get benefits compared to doing nothing, but there's good evidence, randomized controlled trials in, for example, people with overweight or obesity who also have type 2 diabetes. We're talking 40 to 60-year-old individuals. Interval walking provided superior benefits to their cardiovascular fitness, their blood sugar control, and even their body composition compared to moderate intensity continuous training. Again, both of those are great compared to nothing, but if you want to pick up the pace a little bit, this gentle interval training during any type of activity, I would submit is probably going to give you some additional benefit as compared to just the steady state approach.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me because when we hear some of the, especially on YouTube or look at some of the research where it's, you got to do zone 2 for 40 minutes, 4 or 5 times a week. On top of that, you got to do your strength training. And there are some of us who enjoy that and are built for it. But I would suggest the most of the people I run into are like, that's just too much. I don't got time for that.
I agree. And, there's a lot of good messaging out there, but I think that is a deterrent for a lot of people for just the point that you made. It's fine to tell someone zone 2 is great and you got to do 3 to 4 hours of it. But if you're that person who's just, there's such a gulf there between getting up off the couch or starting out and being told you got to do 3 to 4 hours a week of zone 2. And I think, in a very brief tangent, I think there's really good evidence if you're a high-level athlete who's training 25 or 30 hours a week, then that classic 80-20 split of 80% low-intensity zone 2, 20% high-intensity intervals, that makes a lot of sense in terms of enhancing your performance. But if you're just someone who's at the far other end of the scale, I don't think that same ratio necessarily applies. And to my view, the shorter the amount of time you're willing or able to work out, make more of that vigorous, you're going to see greater benefits. So we can't sort of just scale that 80-20 down to anyone. That would be sort of the main exception that I would take to this common refrain that's out there right now around zone 2.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important, at least I feel anyways, that, there's a lot of good information out there. I'm just like, this podcast and Huberman and Tia and all that, where people can actually educate themselves to say, okay, what is, and then work with their health professional to say what's best for me so that I get the best bang for my time that I'm putting into it. But when we talk about, high intensity training, health benefits, if we're looking at the heart, like stroke function and blood volume, how much does that improve and I'm not talking high athlete. Let's talk about the average person who maybe does this once or twice a week. They're suffering with pain or, they have diabetes and they're overweight. If they're doing it once or twice, maybe 3 times a week, whatever that frequency is, how is that improving heart function, stroke function, blood flow, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say the best evidence out there is around cardiorespiratory fitness, which we objectively measure in the laboratory through a maximal oxygen uptake test. So your cardiorespiratory fitness, your VO2 max, that is primarily determined by your heart function. And so we see very commonly within 6 weeks of training, if people are doing 3 interval sessions a week. So in our studies, we're often having people engage in interval training 3 times a week. If they do that for 6 weeks, we see about a 10% boost on average in their cardiovascular function, their cardiorespiratory fitness. And we also know from the epidemiological evidence that having a 10% higher, again on average, improvement in your cardiorespiratory fitness. So 10% higher, 10% boost in fitness is associated with about a 15% reduction in all-cause risk of dying. So again, and also to put that in perspective, that would be like losing 2 inches off your waist, or about a 5-point drop in your blood pressure, or a 1 millimole or 1 point change in your blood sugar. And so, those common metrics that we would measure in the doctor's office, you can see robust improvements in your health with about a 10% boost in your fitness. And that's very easily achievable with a couple of weeks of interval training. Just like it's achievable with more moderate intensity continuous training, you probably just have to do either more of it or for a longer period of time.
So if I hear you correctly, to summarize that, 3 times a week, if I'm doing that for 5 minutes, that's 15 minutes a week. If I do that for 15 minutes, I'm getting 10% reduction in all-cause mortality.
That's exactly right. And again, the key there, it has to be vigorous. It has to be vigorous for you, right? So anything is better than nothing. But if you're willing and able to get into that vigorous intensity zone, a surprisingly small dose of that can enhance your cardiorespiratory fitness, can lower your risk of dying, can lower your risk of developing type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. Absolutely.
And how does that impact on, say, LDL or the cholesterol numbers? Is it...
They tend to change more slowly or with a bigger dose. We like to focus on cardiorespiratory fitness just because it's such a robust marker of health, but we can see improvements in particular in indices of blood sugar control, insulin sensitivity. So we'll commonly measure things like insulin and glucose. And I would say that's probably the best evidence, in addition to the cardiovascular fitness change, would be the improvements that we see in some of these blood sugar profile markers. And you can see some changes in blood fat markers as well, but they tend to not be as robust as some of the changes that we see in insulin sensitivity markers.
And when we look at our veteran or the military population, I mean, military mindset is to push through, which has impacted how veterans go with treatment for chronic pain because they got the peaks and valleys. But we're talking about high intensity training in an older population, so veterans who are obviously older. And when I mean older, and I'm probably get some flack for this, but we'll say 60 and above. But is high intensity training, can that be harmful to someone who's older if they push through too much? If they're pushing their heart rate past their 80%. Now, I guess I should put a caveat in there. This is someone who has been used to working out. They're not an athlete, but they're used to working out regularly versus someone who's not. Could that be detrimental to their health?
Yeah. So 2 points, right? And this is where I'm a PhD, I'm a scientist, I read the literature. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a cardiologist, but, we obviously always say before anyone starts or changes their exercise regime, they should check with their family physician. But like I say, I would emphasize people generally do not need to be afraid of high intensity interval training. And the key points there are: 1, vigorous for you. And also in terms of cardiovascular disease risk, yes, there is, when you're doing the bout, a transiently higher risk with more vigorous effort compared to moderate effort. That's markedly reduced in people who are already physically active. And so I think we don't need to overstate the potential risk of an adverse cardiac event. Again, people don't need to be afraid of vigorous exercise, generally speaking. The second one would be more pain, musculoskeletal injuries, right? And so this is where you can adapt the type of exercise you're doing. And so if you're on a stationary bike, I'm 55 years old. I have knee osteoarthritis. I can't run anymore, right? And so all of my high intensity interval training is on the bike, or I play a weekly pickup hockey game as well. And so on the bike, I can exercise very vigorously. I can get my heart rate up very close to my age predicted maximum without any knee pain at all. Now, if I was to go out and start pounding it out on a track, that would be very detrimental to my joints. And so I think the key point there is you can scale the type of activity for you. Less load-bearing impact forces are going to be much better off for a lot of individuals who have to worry about joint and knee pain and things like that.
Yeah, and I guess that goes, if you're increasing blood flow, is it true to say that also helps with inflammation as you're moving that?
Absolutely, right? Look at the evidence around osteoarthritis and that, and movement is generally a good thing, right? Helping to lubricate the joints and things like that.
Yeah. So this 220 with your age for your heart rate is, I've been reading that there's some discussion on that, if that's actually still valid, if it's...
It's definitely valid, but it's just an estimate. And so, for example, if we took 200 individuals who are 40 years old, their age predicted maximum would be 220 minus 40, 180 beats per minute. 2/3 of individuals would have a maximal heart rate within about 10 beats of that. 95% of individuals would have a maximal heart rate plus or minus 20 beats there. So the point being, there's huge variability there. 220 minus your age is great for a group estimate. It's not very good at individualizing exercise prescription. And, the best way to figure out your own maximal heart rate, if you're willing and able to do it, is basically just, get on a bike and keep turning the workload higher and higher and higher and sort of measure it directly on yourself. Again, there's just a lot of inter-individual variability in those measures.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of close off the show, but one of the key things is how to exercise and what to exercise. And HIIT is just one component of exercising.
Absolutely. We talk about expanding the movement menu, right? Again, public health guidelines are great, but people think, I got to do an hour a day of cardio and that's, the only way to do it. And I should lift a little bit as well. We're just trying to make the point, hey, there's lots of other activity options out there. And if you're going to use a more vigorous approach, maybe you can get away with a little bit less of it as well.
Yeah. And you have a book called The 1 Minute Workout that's kind of talks a lot about this.
Bit of a cheeky title, but just making the point around vigorous intermittent exercise and how it can be beneficial, building on a lot of things we've talked about today.
Well, like you said, 3 times a week, that's 15 minutes, lowers all-cause mortality by 10%.
That's a great take-home message.
I love it. I love it. Martin, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's I could talk a lot longer on this stuff, but it was good. A lot of information. I think that'll be helpful for people that are struggling just to get moving, which is so important. If someone's struggling with chronic pain, that's actually important for anybody. So I really like the message that you talked about today.
Yeah, thanks very much. And just a quick plug, I'm not a veteran myself. My dad was, and my son is an infantry reservist. He's paused his service because he's doing wildland firefighting for the summer. But he was thrilled to know I was going to be on the show. And so I really salute the work that you're doing here and the knowledge translation. It's a real privilege to join you today.
Well, it was great to have you on the show and for all the work that you do. And as I said in our intro, this is our last episode of Season 4, and I'd like to thank our audience from Canada, the US, UK, Europe, and other countries for your support, and keep those comments coming, as your input is what makes this show better. Season 5 will start in the fall of 2024 with some great topics, so hit the subscribe and like button. This way you'll get the latest episodes. For feedback about the show or more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter on Chronic Pain COE, and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. Once again, Martin, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
And to our audience, stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast
is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network.